So, it's been a while. With this good versus bad series, it's not going to be a regular scheduled type of thing because in order for me to really do this to a point where I feel comfortable, I need to make sure I am actually inspired. While these videos do perform very well and I love the fact that you guys are taking so well to this series, I want to make sure that I keep this content as well thought out and as from the heart as possible. Really quickly before I get into the video, I have just recently released one of my singles to you on streaming. It's called Won't Be Saved. I already released a really poorly produced lyric video of it on my channel for you guys to listen to. That is finally up for streaming and up for your feedback. So by all means, go ahead and give me your feedback. Oh, real quick note too to anyone who hasn't seen the original YouTube video, it's super Opethy, and that was by design. All right, enough chit chat. Good versus bad Prog. Now, if you've seen previous installments of the Good versus Bad series, I take one song from each of the same genre, although some people don't necessarily like the comparisons that I take. I take one song that are both in the same genre by two separate artists, and I compare them and say why one is good or why one is bad. And yes, spoiler alert, for people who apparently missed the ending of Good versus Bad metal, I said that there is no answer to this. It either is metal or it is not metal, to clarify the point. So something I'm going to do very differently today for Good versus Bad Prog is we cannot look at individual songs. Let me rephrase that. I think we could look at individual songs, I just think it would be highly ineffective for what prog is actually supposed to be at its core. Prog is short for progressive. Progressive, what does that mean? Back when this genre of rock and roll was being conceived, it was supposed to be enriching what they thought was a really dumbed down art form. When they say sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that was the majority of what rock and roll was. There are people who heard rock and roll and said, you know, there's a lot of really interesting timbres going on here, and it's an interesting ensemble, but it's so underutilized by people who really don't know what the hell they're doing. And the further promotion of this degradation of our art form called music is being promoted by the consumption by the masses. Masses who are very clearly ignorant. This may sound very elitist and pig-headed, but every single one of you feels the same way about the public. Not necessarily about music, but you do feel that same way. The masses, the general consumer, is ignorant, but you don't fall into that category. This is merely taking that perspective, trying to realize it, and manifest better music. You can have an argument as to whether or not the music they made was better or not, but we are trying to crystallize what the idea of prog was, why it was conceived, what it was meant to do. It was meant to push music forward by fusing the ensemble of rock and roll and some of its theory with theory of older times like jazz and classical. They were trying to elevate this rock and roll art form further. Now, bands who were in the formative years of this, like Yes, Genesis, Rush, Pink Floyd, all had pretty distinct sounds, but things that all kind of related to one another as well. Several decades down the line, now we can refer to something as sounding proggy or sounding progressive. Colloquially, when we use this term, we don't mean necessarily that it sounds like it's pushing the boundaries. It sounds like other progressive bands that we've heard before. If your goal as a progressive artist is to sound like other progressive artists who have come before you without putting your own spin or trying to push that envelope even a little bit further, you are ruining the utility of the word progressive. Interestingly enough, I think it is very difficult for a person to try to be progressive and actually succeed. If that's your end goal, it's going to be very difficult for you to achieve it. What I believe to be a more accurate definition of progressive has to do with the releasing of the heart and not binding it to any societal norms. My keyboardist Jesse was trying to get this point to me in one of the last times that we got together and talked about our band business. A lot of times when we're discussing band stuff, it devolves into discussions on music, or I guess you could say evolves, depending on how you look at it. And while I don't think it fully encapsulates the progressive nature inherently, I think it is 1000% necessary for you to make actual music that progresses and elevates. When you have enough mastery of your instrument and your ability to express yourself in a certain way, when you truly command that, and then release your heart from any societal expectations and do a very pure expression through music, there's nothing that compares to that. That is the music that speaks to people the highest. That is the music that lasts for generations. Some of that may be extremely weird, kooky, and clunky. Other forms of it may take place in the most simple and sometimes explained as mundane ways. But another key component to this that I think gets lost is progressive means that you are pushing music forward. So that means that people will have to listen to what you are expressing and latch onto it enough to start incorporating it into their own art. There has to be some appeal, some influence from your music onto a large group of people. Bands that obviously fall into this category: Yes, Genesis, Rush, Pink Floyd, Dream Theater, Opeth. The final key component that I see to something being progressive is fusion. Based upon how human beings learn, how human beings create, how human beings interpret, I can't see an artist being progressive by taking an established art form and just playing with it on its own grounds. I can keep my mind open to the possibility, but I find it extremely unlikely. Most artists take this information from multiple different sources and tease their ideas with it. And now brings me to my comparison. Does Periphery fit in there? Yes, I think they did. Periphery are responsible for really, quote-unquote, mainstreaming the gent sound. Basically thumps, womps, and palm mutes for days, really, really low strings, and a Meshuggah style rhythm. On Periphery 1 and 2, they blended elements of hardcore with Meshuggah style metal, and a quirky, slightly brighter side when it came to adding electronics into their music. You could possibly blame them for all of the gent that's getting tossed around today. Periphery did do a wonderful fusion that really impacted a lot of people, because even though we've heard maybe some of these things here or there before, it's never been blended this way, presented in this context, that actually opened people's minds to a lot of things. Periphery 1 was the first album that I listened to where I actually could start understanding what was happening with a super low-tuned guitar and super deep growls. Periphery 1 and 2 are extremely influential albums. They definitely did do something that hadn't been done before, and they took things that were familiar enough but twisted them and played with them enough to be presented in a way that unlocked something inside people's minds. And you can see Periphery's influence throughout the entire genre of gent. Now, I absolutely love Juggernaut Alpha, but I would not say that album was progressive per se. Yes, it has elements of a lot of other bands that are progressive, like Odd Times, unorthodox harmonies and melodies, unorthodox structure, but that album definitely was not as influential, and I think by that time they recognized what their sound was and was starting to play more with their own personal sound. By the time Periphery 3 and Hail Stan have been released, I don't think that they're having as much influence on people as they had before. Not only that, I don't see them pushing the boundaries of their own envelope very much. Is this a bad thing? No. There wasn't really much that excited me on Periphery 3, and Hail Stan, I think, has some really cool instrumentals on it, but there's nothing that's wholly inspiring to me, and I think there's a number of people that feel the same way. There's actually a friend of mine who is a hell of a prog musician and songwriter who wanted to have an entire bitch fest video talking about how Periphery has just lost it completely and everything's starting to sound cookie cutter. I don't know that I fully agree with that statement, but also I don't think that it's Periphery's mandate to constantly be progressive. I think they're a band that's just trying to make music that they love, and that's perfectly fine. However, based upon my definition of progressive, I would say that they were very influential at one time, and now that is kind of waning off. And I suppose there's an argument to be made that regardless of the direction that the band heads, the two previous albums are still a part of their catalog, thereby cementing them as a progressive band. Now, I know you saw Dream Theater in the thumbnail, and I'm sorry I had to do that because I'm not going to be talking about Dream Theater today. Surprise! I'm going to be talking about the Beatles. I make the argument that the Beatles were the first progressive rock band ever, and it absolutely was not their goal. This past Friday, I listened to the entire Beatles catalog front to back in preparation for this. It was absolutely astounding to see the progression release over release. What we look back on now as extremely cheesy and contrived love songs from the early days of the Beatles in context of that day was actually revolutionary. The Beatles took elements of rock and roll that they loved and combined them with rhythm and blues that they loved from Motown. This hadn't been done before. You could make the argument that Elvis did a blend of gospel and rock and roll, but that's not the same thing. Especially if you hear music of that period or just before that period in these two separate genres, and then you come to the Beatles tracks, you can hear the influences very starkly. As we progress down the catalog, not only does the production get better, but the songs become more and more refined into a more perfect synthesis. It goes from being two genres that were slapped together to two genres that are starting to mold into one cohesive sound by itself. The Beatles' early work is just as influential as the Beatles' later work. Around the time of Rubber Soul and Revolver, we see them starting to experiment more with their songwriting. Until we hit Sgt. Pepper's, where it is a swan dive off of a cliff into just having complete artistic freedom, starting to combine their perfect synthesis of rock and roll and R&B with the added juice of psychedelia. Now, there are a lot of people who did psychedelic rock back in that day, and I'll be honest, a lot of it is trash. The Beatles did it in a way that was honestly more consumable and relatable to more people. I can say, having listened back to it now, years later, with a better frame of reference and I would say a more objective ear, the music speaks louder than the name The Beatles. There are a lot of people who do not like The Beatles, and I understand that. They say that it's reductive trash, it's garbage. There's an argument to be made there. But you cannot deny their command of harmony, their command of melody. The melodies that the Beatles wrote, holy cow. I think their weakest point was their musicianship, but that didn't stop them from being extremely creative. They didn't put limits on themselves just because they weren't the greatest technicians on their instruments. Now, I am by no means saying that every Beatles song is a gem. Definitely not. But there's such a volume of just really, really great songs that, at the context of the time, nobody else was doing. And it spoke to literally millions of people in that day alone, not to mention the billions of people who have now been influenced by their work. You cannot pick one artist that you love today that is not influenced by the Beatles. I can't think of another artist offhand who has taken two genres seemingly different from one another and blended them into its own unique, beautiful sound. A sound that has now carried on for so many generations and whose influence is felt in almost all of the music we consume today. I can't possibly think of a band more progressive than that. They elevated the art form, they pushed it forward. You could also make an argument that in some senses they degraded the art form. I can definitely see where you're coming from. I think there's far more evidence to suggest that they were a much more positive force than a negative one, musically speaking. And you can't listen to I Am the Walrus and not tell me that's just a shit post, like the world's best musical shit post. Now, the one thing I will say, a lot of people love the White Album, and I understand why. There are so many great songs on that album, but you can definitely start to hear them losing the passion on this one. And by the time we hit Abbey Road and Let It Be, it feels like the magic is gone. There are still songs that I love on Abbey Road, by the way. There's a number of them. But Let It Be, for the most part, just it felt like they had already quit, and by that time they basically had. So yes, I think the Beatles not only are the first progressive rock band, I think they are one of the pinnacles of a great example of progressive music. Now, I still think there is some utility in using the word prog to describe bands that sound a certain way, mostly because we don't have any other words to describe them at this point, and it's going to be really hard to get everyone on the same page for that. But while we are misusing this word in order to get the point across to somebody, we should at least keep in mind what the word is supposed to mean. Some other artists that I think fall into the good prog category, if you will, or ones that I think more accurately fit the definition of prog. Steve Vai, 1000%. Frank Zappa, without any doubt in my mind. Just Mike Patton as a human being. Now, while I don't think Mike Patton is as influential as, say, a Frank Zappa or Steve Vai, I think he has had a substantial influence on a substantial number of people. I think Opeth could honestly fit in this category. I think there's some debate as to how you feel about that, especially with their latest iteration of sound, but I think there's an argument to be made there. Examples of what I would consider bad prog, in quotes. Periphery, I think, would fit into that category. My very own beloved Dream Theater, I think, would fit into that category. While Dream Theater are extremely influential and definitely did have a profound impact on pioneering and launching the genre of progressive metal, I don't see them challenging their sound very often. It has definitely developed and grown over the years, especially with lineup changes, but I don't see a further fusion. That's one of the things that actually excited me about The Astonishing. There was a lot of interesting stuff going on, genre-wise, influence-wise, songwriting-wise. There is also a lot of snoozers on that one, so I will agree there. But I don't see them trying to push further in cultivating their sound and trying to push boundaries as much as they used to. Again, I don't think either of these bands necessarily have to. They both make great music. And for ease of defining things, you could call both of them colloquially prog. Now, for clarification, I'm not saying that any of these bands shouldn't call themselves prog and blah, blah, blah. Only I know what true prog actually is. But I think if we're going to use the word, we have to go back to the reasons why it was used in the first place and what that meant. As much as people call it an elitist art form, I kind of disagree. I think there is a better way to make music. I think there is better music and worse music. And I am so open to discussion about that and experiencing multiple different genres of music. If you don't have an open ear and an open mind, it is going to be extremely difficult for a person to truly access the expression from inside. You have, by all workable means, put societal guards around your heart. Those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, if you like what I do in this channel, please like, please comment, please share this video. Please support me on Subscribestar. That is the only way I can keep making badass videos for you. And you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Become the Night. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next video. Rock on!